What's up, everybody? Woo, yeah, this is starting to suck. I'm going on about 3 weeks with no internet, and I'm pretty sure that's the longest I've gone since the internet's been invented. And I'm telling you, when the big one hits, whatever the big one is, whether it's a solar flare or EMP, a hack attack, you're not going to know what's going on. It's just going to go dark, and you're not going to have any way of getting any information. I mean, right now, I can go somewhere to where I can call and listen to another BS date. I mean, they at first they said June 5th, but I know how repairs go. There's no point in calling every day about it. It's going to be fixed when it gets fixed. Just like the bathroom I started last week, where I'm now on day 8 of a 5-day job. And I'm trying really hard to laugh and not cry right now. Everything's frustrating. Anyway, any day now, I'll be back to the good old days with the whole world at my fingertips. We've talked quite a bit about how historical dating is off. They've added a lot of time and pushed the Roman Empire and the time of Jesus way off in the distant past. I've got a couple books talking about this: A Guide to the Phantom Dark Ages, and then History, Fiction, or Science by Fomenko. The first one says there's been at least 300 years added to the calendar, and then Fomenko says basically all of known history happened within the last 1,000 years. The way I see it is about 700 years ago, there was a series of calamities that decimated populations, and the Church of Rome added in 800, 1,000 years to legitimize their claim to everything, secular and spiritual power. And our concept of the Middle Ages was the 0 to 500 AD period. So that would put the rise and fall of the Roman Empire running concurrent with the Vikings and feudalism in Northern Europe, the Moors in Castile or modern day Spain. And really, all they've done is added 800, 1,000 years between the Roman Empire and what was happening in other areas like Northern Europe. Also, a lot of technological advancement during that time: ships and cannons and muskets. I mean, with the Dark Age theory, which is the mainstream theory, the ancients sailed all over the Mediterranean, North Africa, up to England. I mean, they got all their tin from Ireland, I think. And ships pretty well disappeared for the Dark Ages, 800 years. And then better, more technologically advanced ships with cannons pop out on the other side of that vacuum. So look at my list on the left side there, and now let's change the dates. And all of this stuff happened from 700 to 1,300 years ago. That would put like the height of the Roman Republic right at 1,300 years ago. And then the fall of the Roman Empire 700 or 800 years ago. I don't know. It's kind of confusing to make them overlap. But I have read firsthand accounts of Rome being completely destroyed in a freak flood. And then the Church of Rome and people like the Medici family investing heavily in the Renaissance, which is the rebirth, where they reinvented the ancient world the way they wanted it to be seen, with an all-powerful church and kings and queens that get crowned by the church. But the way I look at it is the ancient world ended about 700, 800 years ago with what they say is the Black Death, which was just one part of cataclysmic changes that happened. What nobody denies is that upwards 60-70% of the population was wiped out. So we're about to look at the people that took famous historical events and said that they happened at this time in history. This work is by Anatoly Fomenko, a Russian mathematician that did a deep dive into things. This is volume 4, page 658. So he put a lot of work into this, and like everything, some things he's going to get right, some things he's going to get wrong. The consensual version of global ancient and medieval chronology is apparently incorrect. It was first presented in the works of the scholastic chronologists of the 16th and 17th century, Joseph Scaliger and Dionysius Petavius. Isn't it weird that after 800 years of Visigoth and Vandal rule, then all of a sudden they name their kids Dionysius after ancient Romans? Most professional historians of our epoch do not dispute this version, although its veracity was put to doubt by a number of scientists. We'll call this version the Scaligerian chronology, and it contains a number of phantom duplicates or repeated rendition of the same historical events that are presented as different ones and dated to different historical epochs, which are often separated by centuries and even millennia. All the events dated to the epoch that precedes 1000 AD in the Scaligerian chronology are phantoms that reflect more recent events. This is translated into English, and they use veracity and veracious a lot just to mean true, so I'm just going to say true. Therefore, the true documented history begins around 1000 AD at the earliest. We're not saying that there had been no history prior to that. All we're saying is that no records of earlier events have reached our time. They were replaced with phantom duplicates of later events. So, Fomenko, being a mathematician, put together like these 25 points that he would apply to the so-called historical records. Like, for instance, the story has a king and the king's brother and a special sword, and they had a standoff at a vineyard. And just before they fought, there was a shooting star in the east, and the brother slew the king and buried him under a oak tree. The more variables that are in each story, like king, brother, vineyard, sword, oak tree, shooting star, the more those variables add up, the more likely it is one of them is a copy of the other one. So when Fomenko did this with historical accounts, he said, well, no, these three different stories here are all just one story told three times. Events dated to the period between 1000 and 1300 AD can be divided into two layers. The first one corresponding to the events that received correct dating, and the second layer to events dated incorrectly and reflect later events of the 13th and 14th century. And I'm going to be skipping through and hitting the pertinent details. In other words, the period between 1000 and 1300 AD in our official chronology, official history, is a mixture of real events with correct datings and phantom events whose real datings pertain to later epochs. Just to summarize here, he says that most things dated after 1300 AD are for the most part correct, while other stuff is like 100 years off, but the duplicate phantom stories are still going in the 16th century, so from the 17th century on is where things are generally correct. We tend to think of 1100 AD as not being very much different from 1300 AD, but everything completely changes in 200 years. Our last 200 years have been spectacular, but the world changed almost as dramatically, when the invention of the windmill came along. And especially the cannon. Before that, you had to have, hundreds or thousands of guys ready to go storm a city, and then after the cannon, they could just sit out in the harbor lobbing cannonballs at towers till you just give up. I mean, what can you do? They're sitting out there where you can't get to them. But I can see the world going from our Hollywoodized idea of the Roman Empire to our idea of pirates and cannons in, just 100, 200 years. Not very long. So here he's describing some of his methodology to test to see if they're phantom duplicates, a lot of which he went into more detail about in the first three books, and says the Scaligerian chronology was introduced 16th, 17th century, right alongside the rise of the Jesuits, which either Scaliger or Petavius was one of them, and they did everything they could to monopolize the education systems in Europe. And it's a big taboo to question this official dating, although it was literally just a couple of guys that took random historical accounts and put dates to them. The AD dating system wasn't even thought up till, I can't remember, 9th century. But before that was universally adopted, people just kept time like Kothar was the king of the Merovingians for 28 years. Then his son ruled for 15 years. There was no concrete definitive starting point until much later, and they counted backwards. There was the Julian calendar, but there's nobody that's had a straight-through chronology from Julius Caesar to 1000 AD. If the story of the Byzantine Empire were true, then we should have that. Supposedly, they just lived for 1,000 years, peace and quiet, hardly any wars, no technological advancements, no interesting stories or mythologies, no Hannibal at the gates or anything. And if you ask me, just for a rough gauge, I'd say Rome fell around the 1300 AD area, and then Constantinople at 1492. So after Rome had flooded out and was completely trashed, they tried to keep the Roman Empire alive in Constantinople, which lasted for maybe 100 years, and then the Muslims took over. And once they lost that last stronghold, last vestige of the Roman Empire, then they just said, well, yeah, we were there for 1,000 years. Who can prove us wrong, because the Muslims took over, and now we don't have any way to prove it right or wrong. The whole idea of the Byzantine Empire was just invented in 16th, 17th century. No one ever considered themselves Byzantinian. They were just Romans. And then even after the Muslims took control of Constantinople, then the Muslims considered themselves to be carrying on the Roman Empire. Coincidentally, about the same time, the Habsburgs over in Austria decided to start the Holy Roman Empire after 800 years of Visigoth and Ostrogoth rule. And it's funny how all societal influence for that 800 years just disappeared. That would be like the people of Mexico today, after 400 years of Catholic rule, reverting back to the religious beliefs of the Aztecs and naming all of their kids Aztec names. And every trace of that Catholic society disappearing, and them starting the Holy Aztec Empire. It doesn't make any sense why they would do that, and you would still have some Catholic influence over that society. But there doesn't seem to be any Visigothic influence in the Holy Roman Empire. See what I'm saying? It's almost like you had the Roman Empire, and then shortly thereafter, the Holy Roman Empire picking up the pieces. Anyway, I'm not sure if I'm helping to clear things up or muddy the waters with all of that. This is a pretty interesting idea he's got here. Each and every medieval chronologist, including Scaliger, had adhered to a single concept of dynastic changes inherent in history. Namely, that a certain center of world domination had existed ever since the earliest days of human history, the capital of the emperor. This capital moved its location a number of times, which divides history into 3 epochs with 3 dynasties. First, the Babylonian monarchy, originally Assyrian and Chaldean, then Persian and Median, with Babylon as its capital. Second, the Greek or Macedonian monarchy, with its capital in Alexandria. This city is believed to have been founded and made capital by Alexander the Great. And that should tell you something about the international world that they were living in all the way back at the time of Alexander the Great. His capital was in northern Egypt. Then third, the Roman monarchy with its capital in Rome. The Scaligerian history considers Rome to have been the last monarchy to span the world. Then it split into East and Western empires and all the way down to kings and principalities. The division of world history into 3 epochs was supported by many authors as late as the 18th century. Then the false Scaligerian chronology of the, quote, ancient Egypt was introduced, one that stretched into many millennia. Traces of this old theory remain in the modern history textbook. This is, however, largely de-emphasized nowadays. This process is called civilization succession. The areas between the Tigris and Euphrates, or the Babylonian kingdom, is presumed to be the cradle of civilization. Then the balance of culture and political domination had shifted towards the ancient Greece, and finally to Rome and Italy. Then I'll take that idea of civilization succession up to modern day, where you had the church and the Spanish Empire ruling basically the seas up until early 1800s. Then the rise of the English Empire that has morphed into the English American Empire. And it just doesn't make sense that you had the Babylonians back in the Bronze Age, like 1800 BC, and then pretty well all quiet for 1,000 years, and then the great Greek civilization. It doesn't take thousands of years for the world power balance to shift. And just as an example, this is what Athens looked like in the late 1800s. It just seems like if the entire Roman civilization came and went after the fall of Greece, wouldn't they have turned this into a theme park or something? There's some famous artworks called the Elgin Marbles, and it was the English Lord Elgin that went and fought against the Ottoman Empire in Greece in the 1800s or so. And there's all of these priceless marble statues that he steals from Greece and takes back to England, and they're still in the English Museum while Greece is suing to get their cultural heritage back. Well, what? None of that kind of stuff happened in the 600 years of the Roman Empire? And I did a video a while back showing the Renaissance painters painting the city of Rome. And there's all of these priceless artifacts that are tourist attractions nowadays that evidently nobody decided to loot in the 1,000 years since the fall of the Roman Empire. Here he's got examples of duplicate timelines where you've got stories about Theodosius of the Byzantine Empire, 385 AD, that are the same as the stories of Sinwal in England in 647 AD. And then Theodosius of the Byzantine Empire, who just happened to rule the exact same amount of time as Ina of the English Empire. And he does this from 400 AD up to 1400 AD. And sorry, I got that wrong earlier. 1453 was the fall of Constantinople, not 1492. And just as an example of how well some of these line up, you've got 1222 to 1254, which is a difference of 34 years. And then 1101 to 1135, which is 34 years. They're not all exactly dead on, but like I said, there were quite a few criteria that he was using other than just the dating. Here they are side by side, and you see an almost mirrored image. If it was completely mirrored, then that would be an exact copy, but these are really close. I mean, what are the odds that the 20th ruler of both kingdoms would both only rule for a year? Followed by more or less 20 years, and then more or less 12 years. If these were two completely separate real histories, at some point they would diverge greatly. But these stay really consistent. Here on the left, you've got an old coin portraying Ethelred II, King of England during the years 978 to 1016. And on the right, a coin of King Harthacnute of the Byzantines from 1035 to 1042. And all of the lettering is conveniently worn down. But you know, a mohawk is kind of a timeless cut, so just kidding. Those look pretty much the same. And then he shows quite a few statues that are presumed to represent certain English kings, but there's no indication on the artwork itself of who it is. This is supposed to be from the 12th century, but he speculates it's much more recent than that. And then a few more statues presumed to represent King so-and-so, but if you look at them, these could all very well be the same person. The nose even looks the same between this and the last one, but basically you've just got a guy with mid-length hair, a beard, and a crown. And then a supposed portrait of King Richard II, late 1300s, portrayed with an orb and a scepter just like a Byzantine emperor. Now, he's interpreting this as the history of England was rewritten, copying the true history of the Byzantines. But the way I've always looked at all of this is the Byzantine Empire is the copy. So I'm just going to have to keep researching to see why he thinks the way he does and compare it to how I think about it. But I'm going to end it with this. You've got an old drawing from a manuscript of Matthew of Paris, allegedly from the 13th century. And of course, the all-powerful church is crowning the king. And the name of Henry III, allegedly, is transcribed as three consonants, HNR. Not to get into a full philological discussion, but writing used to be very much different and very much harder to read than today. The original Latin didn't have any breaks. It was just letter after letter. But this reminds me a lot of the ancient Hebrew, where you only have the consonants and you don't have any of the vowels. I don't have internet to look it up, but one of the mega elite families, it was, I'm pretty sure, either the Habsburgs or the Medicis. You can look up their family motto, and their motto is A-E-I-O-U. And I've always seen that as kind of a tongue-in-cheek slight, meaning if you guys are too dumb to put vowels in and spell out a whole word and you're just going to use the consonants, then we'll fill in the vowels for you and we will tell you what we think all of these ancient writings should mean. Anyway, you want to talk about not even scratching the surface of a work here. We've covered from page 658 to 662 in volume 4 of 9 with about 1,000 pages each. And I was trying to get up to what he says about the Trojan War. He says that the Trojan War and the Crusades were the same events. Now, I've spent a lot of time reconstructing the timeline of world history in my head, but even that kind of racks my brain. Is it possible that the Trojan War just happened about 1,000 years ago, and by default, epics like Homer's Iliad are only 900 years old or so? Well, I guess I'll have to do a video covering that, but he shows like 3 or 4 different references of medieval writers, and one says that the real Troy was in Italy. Another says the real Troy was Constantinople, Istanbul at that time. Another one says it was Jerusalem. So evidently, the oldest source documentations we have on the subject don't even agree anywhere close to where the location of Troy is. But I am going to try to download his other books at work tomorrow because we're kind of starting in the middle here, and he establishes the groundwork early on. And I could seriously do so many videos on his work that you guys would never want to hear the name Fomenko again, but I'll try not to beat this into the ground. Anyway, I'll catch you guys on the next one. Static out.